Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining us today for this very exciting conversation. I'm excited because I get to see a couple of our favourite people from across the other side of the Pacific with us today and have a conversation that normally we'd be kicking off in person here in Australia, but this will have to do, and it's a nice break from everything that's happening around the country and around the globe at the moment to be here together to be in conversation around philanthropy, civil society, and all things that are happening around those things at the moment in 2020. So a big thank you to Rob and Lucy for joining us today, as well as many of our friends who we've met over the course of the last few years of your visits into Australia. I'd like to just acknowledge, obviously, before we kick off today, that I'm dialing in today from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nation in Melbourne's north. But I know that we've got so many people here from around the country that it's really important to acknowledge all of the traditional owners whose lands in which we're meeting today. We have, I know we've got, looking through the list here today, we've got folks that are on Turrbal lands in Queensland, Kaurna lands in Adelaide, folks calling in from the Whadjuk people's lands of the Noongar Nation in Western Australia. We've got Jane joining us today from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, as we do many other folks that are dialing in from Sydney today. I'd really like to acknowledge all of these traditional owners and any other traditional owners of lands where we have people joining us across Australia and across the world today. A special acknowledgement to all of their elders, past, present, and emerging, and a special welcome, of course, to any elders who might be with us today. Now, before I kick off onto other introductions, I'd obviously like to hand over to Lucy to make acknowledgements from the US as well.
Thanks, Kat. And I'd like to pay my respects to the Mwekma Ohlone people and acknowledge their traditional stewardship of the land, both here in San Francisco, where I'm calling in from, and of Stanford University and Redwood City, where I believe Rob is. And also acknowledge that the wealth of this country was built on the stolen labor of enslaved people, and commit myself to reclaiming and repairing the damage of that history.
Thank you, Lucy. And yes, welcome any First Nations people from North America who are with us today. I know that we've got some folks dialing in from the US and Canada, so we're greatly privileged to have you with us today. I'd also like to just give a special welcome to our friends at Trillium Asset Management, based out of Boston, Portland, and San Francisco, an iconic ESG investment house that's recently joined the Perpetual family. Welcome. The team across Australia can't wait to work with you all really closely. You're a global leading organisation in the ESG space, and for those of you that don't know who Trillium is, I'd encourage you to look them up and have a peek at some of the amazing work that they do for our communities as well. Today's webinar would not be possible without the ongoing capacity building of the Australian Scholarships Foundation and the incredible work that they do for the not-for-profit sector and its leaders. We want to thank them for their participation in helping to make today possible. Just a couple of really minor other housekeeping things before we kick into the fun stuff. We'll obviously be recording today's discussion and we'll ensure that, that you will have access to a copy of that recording. I'd also like to thank all of you who pre-submitted questions for today. We've had so many and so many wonderful questions that we've basically been able to turn this entire webinar into a Q&A. I will call out a couple of the questions specifically, but you'll probably hear some of the themes emerge if you did submit in some of the other questions that I'll be asking. Apologies if you don't hear them all, but we've just had so many that we'll try to do our best to get to as many as we possibly can over the course of the day. And I know Rob and Lucy have had a look at some of those questions, and I'm sure they'll probably pick up on some of those themes in their responses, as well as will Jane. Finally, for those of you on social media today who would like to continue the discussion going on social media, we have a hashtag, which is hashtag Future of philanthropy. So please do connect through that hashtag with the incredible group of people who are on the line and obviously the panelists today. So over to our panelists, I'm going to introduce and then we'll jump into questions. But I'm sure many of you are familiar in particular with Lucy Bernholz, who has been so generous in giving her time to the Australian sector over a number of years, even beyond the partnership that Stanford has with Perpetual. So Lucy is a senior research scholar at Stanford University's Centre on Philanthropy and Civil Society and a director of the Digital Civil Society Lab. She's been a visiting scholar at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, a fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, the Hybrid Reality Institute and the New America Foundation. She's been an author of numerous articles and books, including, as many of you know, the Blueprint series on philanthropy and the social economy, the 2010 publication Disrupting Philanthropy, and her 2004 book Creating Philanthropic Capital Markets, The Deliberate Evolution. She's co-editor of Philanthropy and Democratic Societies and of the forthcoming volume of Digital Technology and Democratic Theory, and she writes extensively on philanthropy, technology, on her policy, on her award-winning blog, philanthropy2173.com. She has studied history and has a BA from Yale University, where, as we all know, she played field hockey and captained the lacrosse team. She is also an occasional Collingwood, Western Bulldogs, Adelaide Crows supporter, depending on who she's speaking to. But she also, quite importantly, has an MA and a PhD from Stanford University. Welcome, Lucy. It's great to have you back. Rob Reich also joins us, and Rob has also graced the Australian shores on a number of occasions, and we've been really lucky to have Rob join us as well today. Rob is a professor of political science and, by courtesy, a professor of philosophy at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Many of you know that he is a director of the Centre of Ethics in Society and a co-director of the Centre on Philanthropy and Civil Society. He is the author, most recently, of Just Giving: Why Philanthropy is Failing Democracy and How It Can Do Better, from Princeton University Press in 2018. And Philanthropy in Democratic Societies, History, Institutions, Values, which was edited with Cara Cordelli and Lucy Bernholz as well. His work focuses on ethics, public policy, technology, and he serves as Associate Director of the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Initiative at Stanford. Rob is the recipient of multiple teaching awards, including the Walter J. Gores Award, Stanford's highest honor for teaching. But most impressively, Rob was a 6th grade teacher at Rusk Elementary School in Houston, Texas, before attending graduate school. He's a board member of the magazine Boston Review, of Giving Tuesday, and of the Spencer Foundation. Welcome, Rob. Looking forward to chatting with you today.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Wonderful. Also with us is our National Manager for Philanthropy and Not-for-Profit Services in Jane Magor. Many of you on this call will be aware of Jane. She's an experienced philanthropy and not-for-profit specialist, providing advice and support to individuals and families across the charitable sector. She's been with Perpetual since 2011, is a philanthropic leader with really fantastic experience in the private wealth space and the Australian not-for-profit sector. Many of you know that at Perpetual, Jane leads a national team in philanthropy, managing approximately $4.5 billion in community funds and overseeing client distributions that amount to more than, I think Jane this year will see 120 million or so distributed out for charitable purpose. Jane leads Perpetual's capacity work with our not-for-profit clients, helping non-profit boards to build financially thriving organisations that can maximise their impact in community. She's a graduate of the Institute of Company Directors and, of course, holds a Bachelor of Business. Welcome, Jane. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thanks, Kat.
So now I'm feeling quite overwhelmed with the quality of people that we have on the call. I'm glad I just get to ask the questions rather than try to answer them, but I might I might actually throw the initial questions to Rob and Lucy, I guess. 2020 was always going to see the world watching the US, given it's an election year. But instead of just politics, we've watched as the tragedy of the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, just to name a couple, which have pushed forward the need for the BLM movement, both domestically and internationally. We've had all of this occur in the midst of a global pandemic that really, in many ways, has highlighted the gaping inequalities within our communities, all while our social services, health systems, political systems, and the communities around them have been pushed to the limits. Lucy, actually, I might, given the complexity of this, you release a blueprint series every year. Did we predict this? Did we see this? But seriously, in terms of the predictions around what civil society would be facing in the year ahead and what it needed to do to prepare, which I know you look multiple years into the future, is there anything about what's happened this year that has shocked you with your academic hat on, but also in terms of someone that really does think about, how civil society should be responding to communities' big challenges?
Thanks, Kat. And it's really fun to be here. This was the shortest ever trip to Australia, but I miss seeing everybody in person. So a couple of thoughts on this. The relationship in the US between the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement and the street protests now and the actually quite effective activism that's taking place about police reform, I think are really best understood as very connected. They're not separate. They're actually there's a great term I learned from medical anthropology called syndemic, and it means when there's sort of two or more epidemics that converge. And racism is a defining characteristic of the United States, racist systems, and the viral pandemic coming together are going, what we're seeing there is really the conflagration of multiple inequities and harms and a long historical legacy. What I think is quite powerful about it is the extent to which civil society at its best in the caring within and between communities is everywhere all the time now in the US. If it weren't, we'd be in really dire straits because our publicly funded systems, which have been systemically underinvested in for decades, are holding on by thin threads. And so we are in a situation where some of the most basic services one would expect from a government, particularly a government of one of, if not the world's proclaimed wealthiest countries, we're relying on volunteers to collect data at this point. We don't have national data collection systems in place. So civil society is, if you take it as the place where people come together to use what they have to do things that benefit other people, this country's running on it right now. It's really an extraordinary thing. And I think the response of institutional philanthropy and institutional nonprofits, that subset that we tend to focus on, has also been extraordinary. I mean, we've seen some of the biggest foundations in the world come together, take a few creative financial steps to be able to access more money, to get more money out into communities now. I think the message in philanthropy in particular in the US is more money out now. We need it now. There may not be a later. Crystal Haling of the Libra Foundation wrote an extraordinary piece, which I'd point people to, called On the Precipice. And so we've seen a half-year DAF movement. We've seen more spending from foundations. We're also, I want to keep that connected to this extraordinary kind of mutual support that really defined civil society. So that's what we're seeing here, and hopefully it will also be able to reinvigorate a commitment to the public good, to the publicly funded goods, which are failing from lack of investment. The one other thing, the one thing I'd say about this moment, August 5th there in Australia, right? That is surprising to me, is that the conversation about racism, which started 400 years ago, or should have started 400 years ago, but really took off in May after the killing of George Floyd, white people are still talking about it. White people in power are still talking about it. They're making changes in their organizations. They're listening to their Black colleagues and people of color. The road is not easy. There's a lot of work to do, but I would have expected that the white people would have checked out by now. So that's actually a very positive surprise. I don't think this is going to be a flash in the pan the way, unfortunately, it often has been.
Lucy, just before I jump to Rob, what's different about this moment? White people are still talking about racism. I mean, you know, the US history around police violence. Australia has its own really horrible history around death in custody for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. But why this moment? Is it a combination of everything else that we're seeing happening in 2020 that has built a perfect storm, or is there something else at play?
Well, I think the elephant in the living room, I don't know if that idiom translates to Australian, is our president, and a virulently and overtly racist presidential administration that is driving the alternative discussion, is using every racist and misogynist trick he can borrow from previous dictators and his own past history. And for a lot of people who would have, a lot of white people who probably might have otherwise stepped in and stepped out, stepping out now is not an option for a lot of people, because if it means, if that's the alternative, then there's people who just don't want any part of it. White people who don't want any part of it. And so I don't know that it will last. I don't know that it's this great turning point. You know, you can't undo our history in a few months, but we can make some progress. And I think there are generations coming into a voting age and coming into their own as movement activists and coming into philanthropy and coming into civil society now, for whom the kind of structural and systemic and individual racism that's being that the current administration is banking on just is abhorrent and not possible. So maybe there's long-term change.
And I'll come back to you around some of the themes around what we're seeing with young people and their practices and thinking about giving in different ways, whether it's through cash, through kind, through doing, shortly. But Rob, I recently read an article that you wrote about philanthropy shouldn't be relying on, community shouldn't be relying on philanthropy during a pandemic. But we're seeing in countries, particularly those with populist leaders, and the United States falls into that character, But if we can't rely on governments, if we can't rely on rich governments at the moment, isn't that exactly the moment in time when we should be leaning into big philanthropy to step up and fill the void?
Yeah. I want to give you a direct answer to that question, but I have to add just two things to what Lucy just said, because the topic of the linkage between the racial reckoning in the United States and the anemic pandemic response that we've had really calls out for attention. And we in the U.S. aren't used to being pitied by people around the world for how abjectly embarrassing our politics and our response has been. So I want to add two other layers to it, because they filter into the conversation, and then it'll get to the topic of relying on philanthropists. So the first, apropos the Digital Civil Society Lab, I'd add to what Lucy just described, the virulent racism of the current president of the United States, and a sensibility that the values of this country are being so flagrantly violated by our executive. That's for sure an element that's going on. I'd add to it, however, though, the dual use purposes of the technology now in our midst that wasn't there 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. The body cameras worn by police and the cell phones that have recorded so many of the killings and the murders of Blacks in the United States by the police, which then go viral and then also show transparently and unambiguously the police violence that has long been a tradition in this country and in so many others. So we have the introduction of these digital technologies that has transformed the way that people witness what has long been present in the background. And then on top of it, I'd also say that the United States these days, despite all that everyone knows about its current suspicion of immigration, the United States remains a country of immigrants and a country of extraordinary racial and ethnic diversity. And as the white population of the United States has dwindled down to just a bare majority, the opportunity for a president like our current one to activate white grievance and a kind of anxiety about a future in which whites are no longer the majority population, that wouldn't have been possible, again, 40 or 50 years ago. So I think these two features, the kind of continuing diversification of the citizenry of the country, and then the introduction of technologies that allow us to witness what's happening almost in real time in some instances, has made this moment especially potent. So let me get to the philanthropy question. My own thinking about philanthropy is that when it comes to things like the provision of personal protective equipment or gowns in a hospital, we should be absolutely red-faced in embarrassment that we have to turn to our philanthropists with supply chains and know how to work the system in other countries to get these materials to us in an emergency moment. No philanthropist of real means thinks that his or her highest calling is to secure face masks and gowns for hospital use. These are just the bare bones basics of any type of pandemic response, or for that matter, healthcare system. But here's the rub, as it were. This is why you asked the question, Kat. In an emergency, the thing that we're called upon to do, whether it's the government, the companies, philanthropists, or individuals in communities, is to try to meet the moment of the emergency and to do everything we can to get past it. So while I wouldn't criticize any big philanthropist who decided that he or she would turn his attention to securing personal protective equipment or doing things for a pandemic response, I wouldn't want to identify that as an especially best use case of philanthropy. And I would furthermore warn against the idea that our elected politicians could now point in the future to the generosity of the biggest and wealthiest amongst us, that in the future we might then continue to rely upon them for this. So you have to be wary of a dynamic in which you set in motion a downstream dependency on the whims of the wealthy to provide the most basic and essential services that all people should have as a simple entitlement of being a citizen.
And we're truly at risk of that in an ongoing way as we enter into a recession/depression period. We're going to see cuts in places and to services and into spaces where community expectation around receipt of those services are high, and philanthropy will need to plug gaps if we're going to maintain some of the rage around those things. Rob, you've written so much about the role philanthropy should play within a democracy, and it's largely been about being that risk capital. Right. Supporting and funding things that ultimately will enable communities to test, learn, push forward with innovation. Are you personally kind of grappling in this sort of world with, is that the right role for philanthropy exclusively? And I'm not necessarily saying you're saying it exclusively, but,
Yeah.
where's your own mind, I guess, at in terms of your own
Yeah.
thinking around democracy and philanthropy?
I feel like I've been pushed to try to expand some of what I had, written and thought about in the book Just Giving 2 years ago, and then thinking about it prior to that. Just as you said, Kat, I want to think that the particular role that big philanthropy can play in a democratic society that supports democratic ideals rather than undermines democratic institutions is a long time horizon social experimentation to meet the challenges of ever-evolving social problems, a risk capital approach, as you say. And the key element of that, in my mind, has always been the long time horizon approach. The marketplace and the government in a democracy are harnessed to short time horizons. Philanthropy, precisely in virtue of its relative unaccountability, can think long. And here we are in an emergency where time horizons have grown especially short. We who are locked in lockdown or sheltering in place or whatever the restrictions on us can barely think ahead to the next month or two to make plans because we don't really know what the social conditions are going to be like. That's not an especially auspicious setting for big philanthropy on my vision to take place. So I'd separate out two kinds of things that I think philanthropists can and should do in these moments, big philanthropists, that is, people with considerable resources. I think the pandemic teaches us an interesting thing about the long time horizon approach, which is that it's a surprise to me how few big philanthropists had invested their philanthropic resources in pandemic preparedness. You had the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and possibly the Open Philanthropy Project a bit here in San Francisco. But beyond that, for something that has what was utterly predictable from the standpoint of history and epidemiology, in other words, we were going to confront as a globe a pandemic sooner or later, and for something as economically catastrophic as this has been, not to mention the effects on people and their lives, this seems to be an obvious place for philanthropists to put their money into. And I'll point to the fact that while there might be many more people who believe that today, we ought to get up and running a pandemic preparedness, program area. You can't do that overnight. It requires genuine expertise. You can't decide to suddenly know which vaccine to invest in unless you're someone like Bill Gates with decades of experience of building up expertise in the area. What you can do, and this is the second thing then, is of course do the small things like give to local communities to meet immediate needs in ways that you hope will be temporary. So you can try to plug these gaps that our government and public agencies ideally ought to fill. But when they fall down on the job and can't or won't, then philanthropy can help us get past the emergency. And so I don't begrudge any philanthropist who gives money away for personal protective equipment, but I certainly hope that doesn't turn out to be the enduring practice of philanthropists, because I think that would be both an indictment of our public institutions and the kind of thing that undermines the capacity of democracy in the long run to operate.
Great, thank you, Rob. And that's probably a perfect segue into Jane, because Jane, you've been sitting down with families over the last 6 months. 6 months in Australia, obviously, we have our mandatory distribution rates for all our philanthropic trusts is pre-30 June. So the last 6 month period, Jane, we've had in Australia bushfires during that decision-making period. We've had the global pandemic and all that's kind of come with it. So we've had philanthropy really at the forefront of emergency response in this country. What are you hearing around the table when you've been sitting down with families over the last 6 months? How are they going about their decision-making processes right now? And what are you hearing that might, I guess, illuminate some of the thinking from Rob and Lucy into the practical realities for those families?
Well, good morning, everyone, and good evening to all of our friends who are joining us from the States and from Canada. Thanks, Kat, for your question. I think we can all agree that it's been a really challenging 8 months for Australian communities, for communities around the world, and in particular for the not-for-profits who are servicing those areas of need. In regards to how, from a practical perspective, in regards to how decisions have been made, we have seen that there has been a change from how they might have traditionally been done. And I think the starting point to that, if we look back to the Australian summer, so 8 months ago, we were all sitting around barbecues together physically. We were in lounge rooms together, and we were having conversations as families and friends around what we wanted to do to help the current crisis of the bushfires. And like many Australians, the philanthropists that we work with donated to causes that were helping with that crisis, and whether or not that was directly or whether or not that was through one of their charitable trusts or a PAF or a sub fund. The consistency that we saw though was that they were making those grants in a responsive way, and they were also making them primarily at arm's length. So, and I think that this was a little bit of a catalyst as to, I think, where we're seeing a relationship shift between philanthropists and community organisations. Instead of having the detailed oversight and involvement around how those funds were going to be spent, really engaged donors were actually taking a step back, and they were trusting well-governed organisations on the front line to make decisions about how those funds should be best spent. And I mean, this extended then through the COVID crisis as well, and through lockdown, and when those decisions were being made, up to 30 June. I think there's definitely been a greater appreciation that, our grant partners and our community organisations are on the coalface, and they are the experts in dealing with complex societal issues. And I think this has been really mirrored by those that have seen Mackenzie Scott's blog last week. She was talking about the approach that she's taking with her philanthropy. She's backing organisations with leaders with lived experience of the issues that they're trying to solve. She's supporting organisations who have a great track record of effective management and having a significant impact in their fields. And most importantly, she's providing those grants upfront, untied, unrestricted, and with as much flexibility as possible. And, we all know that the funds that Mackenzie has are, on an epic scale. But to Rob's point before, I definitely see that formula and that approach is definitely something that we've been seeing, especially here in Australia over the last 6 months. And I think we'll continue to see that engagement into the future. The philanthropists that we work with, and what we're seeing more broadly across the sector, is that they have been generous, they have been trusting of well-governed organisations, and they've been providing flexibility where they can.
And philanthropy, I think in general, it has never been accused of being particularly fast and responsive. We've fallen into due diligence processes. We've liked to take our time to think about those things. And, and Lucy, I might ask you about this in just a moment, but, social movements don't wait for due diligence processes. And I saw a great comment in an article last week around Mackenzie Scott's incredible gifts. Do we need to rethink the idea that it's not harder to give money away than it is to raise it, because it's actually can be relatively straightforward if you know the organisations to invest in and you trust them to get it done. And I know for a lot of the not-for-profit organisations that are on the line right now, they would love to have that trust of the philanthropists whose relationships they've stewarded and they've demonstrated over long periods of time. That they spend the money well and they know where it needs to go. So, Jane, I guess before I move on, $1 million question for all of those on the line probably is this a moment in time, or do you think there's a cultural shift among those families that you're working with? Will they take the responsive nature and the flexibility into all future grant making, or will it only be in a responsive reaction to disasters and pandemics?
Really good question. And I think the interesting thing that we're seeing as well is that we usually have a lot of conversations pre-30 June, and they were very response driven. And then there's usually a bit of a lull in July and August with that engagement between philanthropist and grant partner. And what we've seen though is that conversation is continuing and it's actually increasing, but the topic and what they're actually talking about is becoming much more strategic. And I think it's because that there is an increased understanding that community organisations are going to need significant support in order to survive, pivot, thrive, and that the future is going to look really different. And I think the conversations that we've been having with not-for-profits in Australia is that we know that at a board level, they're starting to look at their structure. They're starting to look at whether or not they need to redesign in order to be able to provide the best service that they can to their stakeholders and to their staff. And we know that people are looking at the landscape, and that, you know, conversations will be increasing around mergers and acquisitions. And we also know that from an operational perspective, and this is, you know, in the not-for-profit and for-profit area, that people are going to be looking at, you know, their operations and what technology they need in order to continue to achieve their mission. And none of those things are cheap, easy, or quick. And I think that there's definitely an increased appreciation that we're going to need more transparency and clarity between philanthropists and not-for-profits in order for philanthropists to be able to play a role in what that looks like. And, you know, supporting those sorts of things isn't necessarily deemed the most sexy or, you know, programmatic things that people like to fund, but it's going to be vital for us as a community sector, I think, to move forward, and philanthropists are going to play a big role in that.
Absolutely, and there's so many little themes there now that I'd like to throw at our international guests. But Lucy, before we move on from, I guess, the way philanthropists and the way people are giving right now in response to the pandemic, you've been working on a piece of research and a book around how America gives now. And I know from speaking to you last year, when you were sort of still nose to the grindstone around some of it, you were talking about some of the ways that, in particular, younger people are thinking differently about giving and what giving actually means. Are there any things, I guess, now that you're seeing what we've gone through in 2020, that were theories last year for you, or thought bubbles for you last year, that you're now seeing in action in terms of giving approaches?
Sure, and there's a couple of them that I think are quite important and probably resonate in Australia. So most importantly, when we asked people across the US how they give to make the world a better place, two things became really clear. They don't care about tax status, they don't care about tax deductions, and they don't actually care a great deal about the tax status of the recipient organization. Those are afterthoughts for an enormous percentage of people. In fact, they're so afterthoughts, they, you know, until asked directly, they were like, Now, there's a couple of things that, you know, accelerate that. Crowdfunding, first and foremost among them, where, you know, on the internet, it's really hard to tell if something is a not-for-profit or not, or a thing. I mean, it might not even be an institutionalized thing. And I think actually, especially here in the US, we have seen that in magnified 10 times during the pandemic and during the racial reckoning that's happening. People are giving directly to other people. They are giving here in my neighborhood in San Francisco. I could point you around the corner is the main street there. And I'd say that half of the commercial shops have GoFundMe campaigns that are keeping their doors open right now. That's not a charitable gift. That's a way to keep your bookstore in business. So there is a real rearrangement of or just ignoring of the legal structures that have for so long have seemed very important. The other thing that is very clear, and this speaks a bit perhaps to Rob's very important comment about the diversity of the population in the United States, is that very different traditions of care are growing and becoming visible. They're growing because the populations that practice them are growing. They're becoming visible because of technology. So here in particular, let me just mention mutual aid networks, which have not only been a part of various cultures for 5,000 years or longer. They've been very well established traditions here in the US, but you wouldn't necessarily see them if you weren't part of a community that was practicing them. And both, I think, because of the rise of the quote unquote gig economy, which does include still a little bit of this kind of resource sharing, tool libraries and things like that, but also because anything people organize now involves, online spreadsheets, social media, text messaging, and group chat. And somewhere along that line, that digital conversation goes public. And so we see these things that we didn't used to see, we being outsiders to those communities. And I think it's not only, interesting, I think it's going to keep giving alive. It's actually how we're caring for each other, back to the originating comment about, all the systems that are showing off all their long-standing fragilities. This is how people take care of each other. And I think the real opportunity in the US and perhaps in Australia is for us to reconceive our entire policy frame by which we incentivize giving and count it. Because what's happening is happening over there. And we're focused on what's happening over here. And look, it's getting smaller and we're all worried. But maybe it isn't. Maybe the really cool programming is on the other channel. Sorry, bad metaphor. Tired.
No, it's a vital. Please do, Rob. Just a quick comment, Lucy, because and we'll come back to this as well. There is a heightened attention around tax deductible giving as the temperature test for whether or not we're good people as communities anymore. So it's a fascinating kind of analogy, and one that we're absolutely bought into 100% in Australia as well. But Rob, you've been writing about the mutual aid space recently as well. So I'd love to hear your comments in response to Lucy.
I wanted to stitch together that observation from Lucy, both at the beginning, her initial comments, and then just then with what Jane said about Mackenzie Scott's gifts. And for me, the kind of philosophical impulse in me wants to pinpoint something very particular about mutual aid networks and how they're different from other, familiar forms of giving. Lucy pointed to tax deductible status and those types of things, but I have in mind something else, which is that in mutual aid networks, people are equal in power. You're both sometimes a giver and sometimes a receiver. And part of the beauty, in a certain way, from an egalitarian standpoint, a democratic standpoint, is that mutual aid networks don't enlist dependencies of particular people on others. They enlist mutual interdependence. And that is an extraordinarily healthy orientation sitting in communal structures for people to live in. Now, what's that got to do with Mackenzie Scott? As Jane pointed out, what was remarkable about her announcement was that she gave extraordinary sums of money to organizations who didn't have to apply for a grant, who just received a phone call saying that would they be willing to accept in a huge amount of money with no strings attached, the money up front with maximum flexibility, and to the best of my knowledge, no reporting requirements. She's trying to diminish the power that she wields as a huge donor over the organizations. It's seemingly the only power that she had over people was to delegate someone to call them up and to ask would they be willing to accept this money. So that will be very hard, I would predict, to see filter through big philanthropy. Maybe we'll see a bit more of it. It's not, to my mind, coincidental that she made this announcement on the eve of Jeff Bezos's appearance before the United States Congress to testify about antitrust and monopoly inquiries, and where she, I don't want to, inquire about the status of their divorced relationship. But it seemed inescapable to me that she was tweaking his philanthropic, technocratic impulse to wield power over the rest of us by doing philanthropy in the model that she did. But I wouldn't hold out great hope that other great philanthropists will follow in her footsteps.
Yeah, and look, a lot of that comes back to these isomorphic approaches that we take to philanthropy, which is philanthropy is only legitimized if we look like the foundations of the past, and that's the foundation form of the future. And hopefully, if we see more Mackenzie Scotts, and I'm sure I'm speaking for a lot of people on the line for this call, we will see an increased culture of no strings attached philanthropy as well. I would like to, Lucy, you touched on our digital spaces, and you're both involved with the Digital Civil Society Lab. So I have to ask you both, under lockdown, which is what we call it here in Australia, or shelter at home, as I think you call it in California, our physical spaces, our meeting places, how we engage with each other, how we shop, how we communicate. Our physical spaces traditionally have now become digital spaces. And there are so many things that fall out of this, from a legislative perspective, a regulatory perspective, a haves and have-nots perspective in terms of infrastructure. We've been talking about this for years on your visits to Australia, but are we ready for a digital civil society? Where are we at right now? And what are some of the things you're both working on in that space that the community that you have on the line right now might be able to tap into?
Are we ready? No, we're not. We're not ready. And I'm speaking here in the US. But I want to offer two things that have become, the good news is that these things are very clear right now. The first thing is, it is absolutely critical that everybody listening on this call and thinking about their own organization and the future of civil society and the future of democracies stop thinking about the internet as a communication mechanism. It is an on-off switch for every part of our economy and every part of our society. And if you turn it off, education stops. If you turn it off, healthcare stops. If you don't have access to it, you don't have access to it now. I mean, in the US, I imagine this has been happening in cities around Australia. For example, we have moved all of our processes for interacting with our local government to phone calls like this one. And if you don't have access to this system, you have been cut out from being able to speak to your elected representatives or your appointed representatives or anybody. If you don't have access, you don't have access to schooling anymore. If you don't have access, you don't have access to healthcare. I mean, we really had to hit ourselves over the head with a hammer to get this point across, but that's where we are. And we have to recognize that all of our systems, our roads, our buildings, our schooling, our healthcare, our voting, finance, you name it, is dependent on these systems. And we need to then plan for and provide them the way we plan for, or I can't say we here because the US is failing here as well, but the way functioning governments provide and plan for electricity and water. Two things we don't have access to here in the States, but you have to have that kind of fundamental access. So that's the first thing. From a civil society perspective per se, and I'm sure there are people on the call who paid dearly for the process of trying to switch to working from lockdown versus working from home. Really understanding then, if this pandemic, if lockdown doesn't make you realize how reliant you are on these systems, I think you might not be paying enough attention. We really depend on them. And so we have to think about them as on-off switches and how everyone needs access to them. But more important, and you asked about new work at the lab, the really important new work that we've been rolling up over the last year has been to try to lead a global research conversation around what our dependence on these built digital systems means actually for our ability to gather. Now, we were doing this work before everybody got locked in their house. So we were at first thinking, what does it mean for people to meet in a public space, where that public space, say the plaza outside of a library or a schoolyard or a park, where what's happening there is being digitally captured, because that's the world we live in. It's being recorded. by us and our devices, by the cameras, by the sensors, by the cops, you name it, it's being recorded. We have literally digitized our physical spaces. When the pandemic locked us all in the house, what that sort of accelerated was a visceral awareness of this. Like, I can't get together with my people to do whatever it is I want to do. And so really accelerating and diversifying the kinds of scholarship, civil society activism, and policy that's focused on this ability to come together. Because if we cannot come together in ways that we control as people, we will lose democracy. I mean, there's not a bit of it that functions if we're all atomized and individual. And so the analogy I use, because a lot of people, it's hard to really make it clear what we're getting at, is if you think about the online communication and what that's done for misinformation and disinformation, a concept that probably everyone's aware of now, and there's been 2 decades of scholarly research now feeding the public policy about this. The internet as communication, so social media is to misinformation as the Internet of Things, which is the world we now live in, where there's more devices, cameras, streetlights, thermostats, watches connected to the internet. The Internet of Things is to our ability to assemble. And we have to rapidly understand what's going on here and take action. We're seeing a lot of it already in issues like the use of facial recognition and artificial intelligence, right? Being pushed back, being stopped by profound combinations of scholars and activists. And that's really, if we're going to have a digital civil society, if we're going to have a democracy, then we need to build those partnerships in that capacity as fast as we can. So, you know, welcome people from Australia to join us in this. There's a URL, I think, on one of the slides for getting involved in these conversations, and really want to accelerate this this type of work to make sure that we can still come together and do what people do.
Thank you, Lucy. And clearly there's so much content there. So we will make sure that people are aware of where they can jump into the conversation, because it's so vital. Rob, any comments from you on that? You tongue-in-cheek touched on Jeff Bezos and the technocrats being dragged before Congress, but you know, clearly we're not where we need to be.
I have a hopeful prediction to make here. For all the reasons that Lucy just so eloquently laid out, the forms of dependency we have and the lack of genuinely independent capacity to come together digitally, always relying on third-party for-profit services with their terms of service, privacy policies, data hoovering, et cetera, et cetera. So here we are, Lucy and I at least, in the belly of the beast of Silicon Valley that's reinventing the world with digital technologies. And again, not just a communications device, but all of our lives. The hopeful prediction I want to make is that we in Silicon Valley had 20 years of a kind of techno-utopianism in which the kids coding away in their garage as hackers would overtake the Goliaths of the world. And digital technology would be inherently liberatory and freedom would spread across the world. And this was the language of the early founders of the internet and lots of these companies. And now we've had a decade's worth of digital dystopianism or techno disaster that is befalling us. Facebook is rotting democracy from within. Our devices are addicting us to them for nothing more than a kind of arcade game. And I think we are finally ready, emerging from the pandemic whenever we do, for a mature conversation about the digital behemoths that are now the fundamental parts of our lives. Just for the reason you said, Kat, it's inescapable that without these digital tools and platforms, our lives in pandemic would be so much worse. We are fully aware of how important these services have become in our lives, and we can stop being extremists about utopians or dystopians about this world and try to harness the benefits and mitigate the downside risks through sensible policy. That's the conversation I think will start to happen next summer.
And I think we've linked through, thank you, Rob. I think we've linked through now the Digital Assembly Network link. So, and Rob and Lucy have been really clear with us in the lead up to this. They want engagement. They want to hear the voices from this country as well. So please do engage. And anyone that's spent time with Rob and Lucy in Australia, know that they hand out their contact details quite easily. So if you want to have a conversation directly with them, I'm sure there's ways to do that as well. So so thank you. We are running out of time. So there's probably Jane, for all the folks that we have on the line today, I know one of the things, and Rob touched on it previously in his commentary around philanthropy, insofar as the available funds and how we incentivize more giving. We have some unique charitable structures in Australia. We're hearing lots of things coming out at the moment around how much will philanthropy be impacted in terms of its mandatory requirements to distribute funds over the coming year or the coming 2 years. We obviously sit within a finance business. We act as trustee for many of these foundations. We've been spending a lot of time looking at this. I just wonder whether or not there's some comments or commentary you might be able to make around what funding is likely to look like before we get into then how do we incentivize more.
Yeah, definitely. And I think look, there has been a lot of conversations around this, and it's understandably so. And I think probably just at a high level, just to remind everyone, there are three structures. So there's private charitable trusts, and then there are the ancillary funds, where we've got private and public ancillary funds with mandatory distribution rates. So if you look at the charitable trusts, look, it's likely that we'll probably see a 30 to 40% drop in distributions, where we know that those trusts can only distribute income, but keeping in mind that there are charitable trusts where capital isn't restricted, and there could be some flexibility there. So that's definitely something that as a trustee we're going to be looking at. From an ancillary fund perspective, we don't see that there's going to be a significant drop in the short term, especially if you look at how the markets bounce back towards the end of June. However, probably careful to be careful to understand that there is going to be less income to invest in growth. So from a long-term perspective, there could be a bit of a shift there. But what we do see is that ancillary fund investors will be looking more at total return rather than income return. So it's something that we're very aware of. And Kat, you and I have had conversations around as much transparency as we can provide to the sector over the next 6 to 12 months around what expectations could be there, because we want to make sure that everyone kind of understands the landscape that they're operating in.
Great, Jane, and thank you for that. And just for those on the line, we will actually be, I know many of your boards, if you're in a not-for-profit organisation, probably don't understand some of the distinctions between the different foundation types and how they will likely be impacted around markets at the moment. So Perpetual will be releasing a paper just to help you, particularly if you're a fundraiser, to try and explain where some of the tension is going to exist with regards to your traditional revenue flows. Now, we know that the Australian government has been trying to incentivise more giving over the shorter term. Are you hearing from philanthropists that you're working with that, regardless, particularly private ancillary fund and public ancillary funds, regardless of what the mandatory rate is, they're going to maintain their giving and do more? Or are we hearing that people are desperate to kind of claw back?
To be honest, I haven't had one conversation where there's going to be a clawback. So it's very much that donors are wanting to continue to be engaged with those organisations that they've been, funding for a number of years, but they're also going to be looking to see how they can support organisations moving forward into helping them look at what they need to do in order to continue to achieve their mission. So I don't see that there's going to be a drop. I think that the level will be consistent. And I think also the other thing to keep in mind that there's the structural distribution, but then there's also the distributions that are happening outside of that, where we're seeing that there's a bit of a shift happening there as well.
Brilliant, Jane. And I can say that I was on a call with a group of philanthropic foundation CEOs yesterday, and that is consistently what I'm hearing. which is fantastic. So we need that kind of commitment going forward. We are just about out of time, which is amazing. That has absolutely flown, and we've really just we've just touched the tip of the iceberg. But Lucy, if we were ever in doubt about your love for our country, clearly we are no longer. I'm not sure that your cricket's probably not the favourite of the sports that you've engaged with, but I'm glad that you haven't, with Jane and I both on the line, chosen a football team to wedge a divide between us forever. You'll see on
it's too risky to pull out the football is too risky.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rob, Lucy, thank you so much for your time today. It's just wonderful talking with you and just seeing some of the things that you're spending time thinking about, and they really are wonderful perspectives that it's a privilege to have time with you both. So thank you both for coming. You will see on your screen now. Yeah, absolutely. There's Rob and Lucy's email address. So if there's anything we didn't answer today, then you'll have an opportunity to contact them directly. But please do engage with the Digital Assembly Research Network. Please do, as a not-for-profit organisation, make use of digitalimpact.io as a website. I refer nonprofits to it almost weekly. Nonprofit board members find it really, really useful. It has so many resources around how to manage digital data, digital governance for not-for-profit organisations. It is a wonderful, wonderful resource. So please do utilise that. And of course, the Perpetual team, we're obviously open to conversations around what's happening in the sector at the moment. So please do stay in touch with us. We look forward to continuing these conversations and engaging around what's next for philanthropy and civil society. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat.
Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.